Thank you guys for coming. So the book is called Advancing Your Photography. Let's just start right there. Photography is something that you're continually advancing. You never get to a plateau. You never get to a point where you go, I know it all. This is it. You can buckle it up. Unless anybody in this room has gotten there, I want to talk to you. For me, it's a continuous process of daily learning something and figuring out how I'm going to capture that incredible image. So briefly, my background, I have been a photographer most of my life. I started really when I was about 12 years old. In the last decade or so, I started doing video shows, interviews with a lot of big name photographers. Has anybody seen those? They're on my YouTube channel. Okay. Joe McNally, Chase Jarvis. We're going to hear from some of these guys today. And after over 1,000 hours of interviews, it dawned on me that, you know, I should take some of this information that's in my head here and put it into a book. And the reason I wrote the book was because videos are great, but you can't carry them around and, you know, pull them out whenever you need it. This book is printed, it's the size that you can put in your camera bag. And the whole idea is it's a handbook, which means you have it in your hands, not on your shelf. Remember that. It's a handbook so that you can refer to it and advance your photography. So anyone can benefit from this, but I assume you're here today because you've hit a point, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or even a pro, where you want to move on. Am I right? Everybody here has decided at some point, okay, I really want to learn some more things about photography. And in the next hour and a half, I'm going to take you through a short, really, really short version of what's in this book. But you really do need to read the book to get the rest of it. And then supplementing it is you can find on my YouTube channel over 300 videos that go along with the book, okay? Keep your questions, as she said, to the end, and we'll address them all. Okay, so the first thing is this. This took me a while to figure out. What is the structure of photography? It has a beginning and a middle and an end, like everything. And it turns out it's not a linear path like this. It's more of a circular path. And visualization is at the hub of this whole thing. We're going to talk about visualization specifically in a minute, but it basically means to see before you press the shutter. You know, a snapshot is when you're doing this. You're not thinking, you're just pushing the button. Visualization is where you get in your mind's eye what it is you want. And that guides the whole process. So from visualization, you learn your equipment. And there's no point in doing it the other way around. Equipment will not take a photograph. Cameras by themselves don't make photographs. People do. So as much as I love equipment, and we're in the hub of the universe as far as equipment, and I think you guys should buy as much as you can while you're here, you are the one that is operating that camera. And so it's your vision that guides that. So once you learn your equipment, you definitely need to learn how it works. Then we get into capturing. And capturing everything that you think of in terms of composition, lighting, framing, all these tools fall into capturing. But again, until you know what your equipment's going to do, it's really hard to say how you're going to capture it. Then we get to the next stage, which is processing. Now, I come from, which I'm sure some of the people in this room do too, the film days, where once you press the shutter, you had to go back to the darkroom and develop it. If you took it to the drugstore, you were really disappointed. It was horrible. You know, you got this beautiful sunset, and you got these pictures back that look, what is this little muddy thing here? I can't even see the sun. So processing is where you're bringing out, again, what your vision is. And that could be the original vision that you had, or you may revisualize it at that stage. You're bringing out what you're trying to show your audience, whoever that may be. And that brings us to the final stage, which is called sharing. Now, sharing, you know, it doesn't just mean sharing on social media. That is one way of sharing your work. But sharing also means getting the best prints made and put them on the wall. Get them framed Put them out, get them out into the world. Too many times I see people leaving everything on their computer. You know, the computer isn't going to ooh and ah over your pictures. You got to get them out to the world to get the full experience. And there's nothing like having a show where you put your work on the walls and you see people looking and appreciating your work. There's a lot of other ways to get your work out there, but however you do it, that's the final stage in the process. And the book basically has a chapter on each one of these stages and putting it all together. Does that make sense? It took me a while. I mean, it took me many hundreds of interviews before I, as simple as this seems, to figure it all out. I originally had it in 4 stages, and then I broke it apart and I figured out, okay, visualization really guides this whole thing. The reason you see arrows going back and forth is that when you learn one of these stages, it will actually interact with the next one. Like for instance, you learn, okay, I can visualize, and I'm going to tell you how to do that in a minute. But when you get your equipment, all of a sudden, when you learn that equipment, you realize what you could do with it. So the next time you go out and use it, your visualization has improved. Same thing in processing. You learn what you can do in processing. You also find out there's some things you can't correct in processing. You can't fix everything, and you shouldn't try to. Your objective as a photographer, I believe, is to capture the best you can, the best image you can. We can do all kinds of cool things in Lightroom and Photoshop and eliminate things, but you know, it might have been easier if you just took a couple steps closer to the person and eliminated the trash can that was over here. So I'd rather have you go in that direction. Okay. Leave room in your teacup. There's a little story. There was a master who really understood his area, and he was visited by this very arrogant professor who challenged him, said, "You must teach me right now." So this Zen master actually sized this guy up quickly, and he said, "Okay, before I teach you, let me offer you some tea. Would you like a cup of tea?" And he said, "Okay, sure, Mr. Arrogant here." So he pours a cup of tea, and as you can see, he keeps pouring. The tea is overflowing all over the place. And the arrogant professor said, "What are you doing? You're spilling tea everywhere." And he said, "This is like your mind. It's already full, so whatever I pour into it will just spill all over the place." Clever. So make sure you have room in your cup. That's the point of this one. You may already have certain ideas. That's great, and you should have those ideas, but just leave room to take in enough new data that you can operate with that. Okay, this is step 1. I don't know who this guy is here that we picked for a model, but this is visualization, and this is a visualization of a visualization. This is where I live, Big Sur, California. Any of you guys ever been out west, seen that? It's one of the most beautiful places in the world. Unfortunately, it's been hit hard with rains and fires. And north of here, we have some really famous photographers. Ansel Adams lived there. Edward Weston lived there. The Weston family lives there. Lots of people have taken photographs here. Visualization means you see something. Something excites your interest. And before you even put a camera to this, you basically, and sometimes it's really helpful to do this. You know, there's 2 ways you can do that. I used to recommend cards, but you know what? You can forget them. One thing you usually have with you at all times, I hope, is your hands. So it actually does help to do this. Put a frame around it. You know, if you want it to be like more technical, you can do it that way. It's like 2 L's. And you actually can visualize before you get the camera out, which I recommend, and you're going to hear about that in a minute. This quote here, I love this. Visualize this thing that you want. See it, feel it. You want to, get there with your emotions and feel it. Believe in it. Make your mental blueprint and begin to build. That's the best statement I know of visualization. It comes from, and it means the act or fact of visualizing. It's the power or process of forming a mental picture or a vision of something not actually present. It's that mental picture. Does everybody know what I mean by this? So this is something that you sometimes have to stop. You know, we can be really busy and we're running around, and we have to actually stop sometimes and go, what is it I want to capture? What am I after? What do I want at the end of this process? You know, the difference between being a tourist, let's say in Paris, and you're going around and you're looking at all the sights, and you know, you're not really thinking in terms of a photograph, you're just sort of taking everything in. And going by yourself, getting what I call getting in the zone and saying, what do I want to come away with when I, you know, 5 years from now I look back on my Paris pictures, what do I want? Do I want a bunch of pictures that look like postcards and snapshots? Or do I want to find something I can really be proud of? And that's what your objective is. So once we visualize, we're going to hear from Chase Jarvis, who is, anybody here familiar with him? He's the founder of Creative Live. He's been a phenomenal photographer. He's been a friend of mine for many years. He told me, and I asked him a question, so what are the things that you do, Chase, to get your images? And here's what he said.
Well, when you asked me that off camera, I had to think about it for a second, and it quickly came to me that there's just you know, four or five things that I do every time. And the first thing is I look at the scene without the camera. I walk around without the camera pressed to my face, because when you put the camera to your face, you see a lot less than you do just walking around. So I'm going to walk the area that I'm going to shoot without the camera to my face and look for interesting things. When I find things I'm going to shoot, or you know, I can build a scene in my mind, then I'll start putting the pieces together, and that's kind of a visualization for me. So when I'm visualizing, I know exactly how I want this thing to look. I know I want this edge of the frame to be, you know, next to this tree, and I want my subject running or jumping into this part of the frame. And I even actually pre-visualize all the way to what this could look like in post-production. But suffice to say, I kind of visualize the shot. And
visualizing all the way through to post-production and really to the final point. So a lot of his work, for instance, is done in, published in a magazine. So if he's visualizing, well, how is this going to look? You have people running down the road, but let's say it's reduced in size. How will it look? Will it really bring out what I'm looking for? And that's, again, that whole process of visualization. So what he said there is a lot of times he'll just walk around without the camera pressed to his face and look at the area. And this is something, remember, as simple as that, you know, that's a really simple point, but sometimes we can get kind of stuck behind our camera and forget to look out. A camera is very limiting. You're already, you know, you've eliminated all this space here, and you're only seeing through this mechanical thing. Because remember, people take pictures, not cameras. So it's just a handy tip. Go to your area where you're going to be shooting, look around, get some ideas, that's your visualization, and then get your camera out and start shooting, okay? How do you strengthen your visualization muscles? How do you gain this ability to visualize? Very important point, because if I just say, you guys go out and start visualizing, and I don't give you a way to do that, I haven't really shown you the tools. Okay, this is Joelle. Joelle is an amazing photographer. When he was 16 years old, he shot the stills on the first Twilight movie. So, you know, every movie that's made, there's a photographer there shooting stills along with the film, so that when they go into publicity mode, they've already got a bunch of really great stills. So he was chosen when he was 16 to do that, and that totally launched his career. This is an example of one of his photographs. If you look at it, the lighting is just phenomenal. Because what you've got here, I'll just point this out, notice how well lit the subject is. Even though it's a dark and gloomy day, there's an adequate amount of light on this subject so that you really see the face. And that's not done with a strobe, by the way. He actually takes, he's probably using LEDs now, but he takes small soft boxes out into the field with a little generator and fire that up and light the subject just the way he wanted. So I asked him on camera, okay, Joey, how did you learn composition? How did you learn lighting? And what he said really surprised me, because at the time he was 20 years old. He said, I go to museums and I look at art. And I do that all the time. I do that a lot. And I try to emulate what I've seen in that artwork, whether it's Rembrandt or Vermeer or whoever, probably not Picasso so much, at least in his later work. But he said, look, these guys figured out lighting. They figured out composition long before photography. It's true, you know, photography is a relatively new subject, but it grew out of painting and engraving and drawing. And these people didn't have any tricks. You know, they had to put everything on the canvas to make it look the way it did. So something I recommend is take time to go to museums and look at art, and I'm going to give you a list of things that you should look for. So it's not just a random, I like this painting, I don't like this one. No, stop and analyze it. And I'll give you some questions. These are all in the book. Almost every one of the people I interviewed said this one time or another, that where they really learned how to make lighting and composition pop was from the masters. There's a marketing guru. His name is George Lois. You probably haven't heard of him, but he designed 92 covers for Esquire. He's not a photographer, he's a designer, and he's incredibly creative. He goes to the Metropolitan Museum every Sunday. This is his holy day for taking in, as he calls it, the creative DNA of the culture. Why go to a museum instead of just looking at it online or in a book? Because it's a totally different experience when you see that painting. When you're there and you really get the final version of what that painter or artist conceived of. When you're looking at it on a computer screen, you're going to already have lost a lot of that. Looking at a book is okay, but go to museums and look at some of these questions. I don't expect you to memorize these, but these are some of the things you would look for. How was the subject composed within the frame? How were they lit? Where was the light coming from? You know, they had a room with sometimes, like in the case of Vermeer, who I really recommend that you study, he had one window, and everything that was lit on his subject came from that one window, which is another great technique that you can use in photography. How did the light strike the subject? Look at the various layers, and by that I mean, you know, I'm not talking about a Photoshop layer. I'm talking about the foreground. What do you see first? What's in the middle and what's in the background? And those layers need to work together. One thing you should keep in mind is that you're responsible, and I'm quoting another photographer we'll get to in a minute, Bob Holmes. You should be responsible for everything within that frame. You're the photographer. You know, if it were a film, you're the producer, the director, the cameraman, everything, all rolled into one. And you want to be responsible for everything within that frame. If there's something that you don't like there, move. If you can. I mean, sometimes, okay, look, power lines are going overhead. They're distracting. I really want to get this shot. I'll go, okay, I'll get that in Lightroom or Photoshop later on. But as much as I can, I'll move around and see if there's an angle I can get so I don't have to do that. You know, if there's something in your frame that is pulling the viewer's attention away, do something about it. Take responsibility for it. So that's what the painters had to do again. Where is your eye drawn? You don't want to have two places where your eye is drawn, and this is a common mistake I see when I do critiques. What is it you want me to look for? You know, I see a boat over here and I see a bird here. Am I looking at the boat or the bird? You know? So if you want me to look at the boat, that's fine. Have the bird either disappear or out of focus. If you want me to look at the bird, have the boat out of focus. I mean, that's just a really basic point. And how did those painters de-emphasize things they didn't want in the frame? Did they do it through making it darker, which Vermeer does a lot? All of a sudden, these things start to disappear because they're just darker. You know, what was the technique? How did the artist use color? Or did they use black and white? Can you find a pure black and a pure white, which is a full dynamic range? And that's what's going to make a black and white look great, is you want a nice dynamic range. You want to have a black, you want to have a white, and gray in between. What's in focus and what's out of focus? Again, that's going to, what I just mentioned, will de-emphasize or emphasize. And you should be in control of all those things. And then finally, and most important, what's the overall message? As you stand in front of that painting, what do you feel? What are you getting from, you know, that Rembrandt or that Vermeer or again, that Picasso? What is it you feel? Because that's the experience you want your viewers to get. Not that same one, but you want them to feel something from looking at your photographs. Am I right? You definitely don't want them going, huh. And, you know, it's not good enough to just get a like on Facebook. We really want to get some emotional connection going on. Okay, training your eyes to see those shots. And again, that comes after, load up your mind with these visions that you've seen and go out and look for them. It's okay to even emulate or copy what you saw. That's fine. You can do that. No one's going to come after you and say you shouldn't have done that. And you basically go out and look for your vision. And you use these handy little things you've got right here. And once you've got it, then you start taking photographs. Okay. Now, you got to know your equipment. This is who can call out what camera this is? It's an M2, close. Yeah, not bad though. Okay, this is the camera I used in art school. I went to art school at the San Francisco Art Institute at the same time Annie Leibovitz was there. And I think it was standard issue, we had to have a Leica. That was just the camera, you know? There weren't that many cameras. There weren't as many cameras as there are today. So this was the camera that one of my mentors and heroes used, Henri Cartier-Bresson. Anybody studied his work? Definitely I recommend him. It's a very small, even though it's big here, it's a small camera, so he could carry it around and get photographs on the street without, you know, this big piece of equipment that called attention to it. You got to get to know your equipment. You want it to be a friend of yours. You want it to be an extension of you. You want to understand each and every control in there. There's a big glossary, and I make sure that every control in the camera, the key controls, are defined in the book itself, and usually they're illustrated. There's a glossary at the end that breaks those all down. Now, one thing I want to demystify right now. Who besides me has ever gotten overwhelmed looking at a modern digital camera with the number of menus and submenus and, okay, right? It's confusing. It can be daunting. It can be like, whoa, there's so many things here. How am I ever going to learn all this? Well, here's the deal. There's about 8 controls that you really need to know, okay? And yeah, you can study all that other stuff. I'm actually exaggerating. There's not that many. There's less than 8. In the old film days, what did we have? We had focus, we had exposure, we had aperture. We didn't change ISO because the film was in the camera. You'd have to have a Hasselblad where you change the back. So you put whatever you put in there and that's what you shot with. So that's like 3 controls there. Well, there's a few more in digital. There's white balance, there's, you know, but there's not that many. There's about 6. And you just need to know those cold and make sure you really understand how they work together. And when you're studying your camera, there's a couple of things I would recommend. Make sure that you've got it there with you so it's not in your head. Have your camera out in front of you, touch all the knobs, touch the menus. And I'm saying this to people who've been around photography as long as I have, because you're going to be learning stuff all the time. Make sure you do have that piece of equipment there that you're working with. Practice, then look at it, look at the pictures. You want to get to the point where you know what that camera will capture. Every camera is a little different. They don't all capture color the same way. You have to actually get familiar enough with your piece of equipment so that you know exactly what it will do. And that just comes from these steps right here. Practicing, shooting, looking at it. Okay. Now, here's a handy little thing I'm going to recommend to you. This is an app I developed called Zither. If you go to this website, zither.co, you can get a link to it. It's only on iPhone right now. But what it does is it will record all your equipment. Very handy, it's free. You can put all your camera equipment in there. You just hold it up, scan the barcode, it finds it, and then here's something that it will do. It will find the manual for you and store it on your phone. Super handy when you're out in the field and you've forgotten, how do I adjust this or that? You just pull it up on your phone. Is that cool? So this is an example. This is a Canon 5D Mark III. This is how it stores the information. It even tells you how long the warranty is. You know, I thought of this because, you know, when you have a piece of equipment and something goes wrong with it, isn't it nice to have the warranty get it fixed? Have you ever failed to get something fixed and found out later that the warranty would have covered it, but you didn't do it in time? I had a really expensive watch, and it was a few months out of the warranty. It needed a $500 repair. And they said, hey, I'm sorry, if you brought it in a little earlier, even a month after, we could have gotten it done. So this thing pops up and tells you how much time you have. It will record your serial number, so if you do need to look up something, it's all there, and then it keeps track of your manual. The other thing I'm going to recommend is that in addition to your manual, get what's called a field guide for your camera. Because manuals, if you haven't noticed already, aren't necessarily the easiest thing to read. But the field guides, somebody has taken the time to really get into your camera and give you a simple version of it. So what I use is both the manual and the field guide. Does that make sense? Okay. This is an example. This is a shot in Paris in the Tuileries, which is the garden. And I looked at it, it's a carousel. I didn't want to take it so it was like a 500th of a second and all the motion was stopped. So I knew I wanted motion in the picture. This is called dragging the shutter, when you get a long exposure so you get motion. The problem was I didn't have a tripod with me. So you have to improvise. So what did I do? There was a pole sitting there. I propped the camera on the pole and held it as steady as I could. Fortunately, that handled most of the motion right there. And it was like a 1/6 of a second. I think it was a pretty long exposure, which you can see none of it is in sharp focus, which was okay with me. But I really wanted the motion here, but enough sharp focus to contrast with that. And that's just from, again, knowing your equipment, knowing what you can improvise with. It's a really good idea to be able to improvise tripods all the time. And frankly, you can use objects like this to sit them on. The other thing is steady yourself against a wall like this. This becomes a tripod, right? And you can hold a shot pretty stable that way if you do that. So these are just little tricks that you pick up as far as, okay, I don't have a tripod, what do I do? Okay, I've got 2 quizzes here. This is the first one. Without looking, don't look at your iPhone or do any searching. I'm going to ask you, and this took me a while to find this. Who knows the origin? Why is it called f-stop? Why is it called a stop instead of an f-point or an f-banana? Or why do we call it f-stop? Does anybody know? I'm sorry? No, not well. Yes, it did. It came originally when it was a film cameras, but there's a specific reason why it's called an f-stop. Do you want to know? Yeah. Just kind of a point of curiosity. So originally, lenses had this thing that you would slide in. This is actually a modern lens for sale on the B&H website. It's a remake of a very old lens. And these items are called stops. And you notice they're different sizes. Each one of these represents a different aperture size. This one is 2.2. This is f4. So they didn't adjust it with a dial. They pulled these stops out and put in another stop. That's the origin of the word f-stop. It's just trivia. It's not going to change your photography. But it's kind of fun. Next time you get around your pals, you can say, hey, do you know why it's called f-stop? Oh, by the way, before I forget, I'm going to give this away at the end. This is not going to be a quiz item, but this is a cool bag from Think Tank Photo, Signature Series. What I like about this bag is that when you're out shooting on the street, you don't want to carry around a big, roller camera bag. You want to have something that's kind of over your shoulder, and it will hold, you can put your Canon or Nikon or whatever, and you can put other stuff in here. Bob Holmes, again, you'll hear about, travel photographer. He's very practical because he's gone out on National Geographic's shoots for years. He says some of the things to think about, I know I'm skipping around a little bit, some of the things to think about when you're packing for a street shoot day, which is really fun, and certainly when you're traveling, you should be prepared. So put in here at least one camera. If you can fit another one in, great. Make sure if it's going to be rainy, you have like a little some rain gear. And I actually have one that folds up. I didn't bring it with me, but it folds up to about this size. So you're always prepared. Have some water in here. Have some snacks and things like sunscreen or whatever else you want to carry around. Make sure that you're fully prepared, just like the guys out on assignment, because that's what they do. Because you don't know, sometimes it might take hours of waiting for the shot. That's another point. Listen, it takes as long as it takes to get that shot. And if you have to wait for the sun to change, or for clouds to move, or people to move around till you get, it's not just an instant world. It's you, again with your vision, going out and creating that shot. Okay? All right, moving ahead. So now we're into capture, which is the third phase. And capture means you're blending your visualization with knowing your camera. Don't get hung up in the quote rules. There are no rules, first of all. Yes, there are guidelines, okay? There's like, we hear the rule of thirds, okay? Is that a rule? Somebody going to come and arrest you if you break that rule or fine you? No. You know what? It can work for sure. Having, if you set your camera, which I do, with a grid. How many of you guys do that? It's really handy. It's a handy reference. It's a reference that shows me, okay, I might want to move around this way. But sometimes dead center looks great. There's a lot of portraits that have been shot that way. And sometimes, yes, I might want to step over this way or that way or whatever. But you need to know the rules before you start bending them and breaking them. So I do go through not every single rule or guideline of composition, but I try to cover the main ones in the book. I'm actually planning a follow-up book which is just going to be on composition. Because I think at the end of the day, that's probably what most people want to know more about. Would you agree? Once you've learned your camera and you get the idea what visualization is, learning more and more about composition is really important. Training your eye by using your skills of visualization, which I already told you. You're going to go to museums, you're going to look at work all the time. And just so you know, okay, I'm not going to discount looking through magazines. I do that all the time. I love to just look at photography in a magazine. And it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be a photography magazine. It's Architectural Digest. They do an incredible job. You can look at, I wouldn't recommend People so much, but look at Fast Company or whatever, where they're kind of like trying to push the envelope all the time. See what they did, because you're going to probably get some ideas out of that. Again, that's part of training your eye. Learn the rules, learn how to break them, don't get stuck to them. There's two traps that I see in photography that I would like to help people avoid, and I mentioned this in the book. The first one is the equipment trap. If I only had the right this or that or whatever, you can get trapped in that frame of mind. I'll tell you what, you give an iPhone or a Brownie box camera to a really great photographer, they're going to come back with incredible images. You give the best setup that you can imagine, a Sony full-on kit, or Canon or whatever, to somebody who really doesn't know how to do these things, they're not going to come back with great shots. A camera is a paintbrush. It's a tool that you can use. It's like going into a kitchen. What does a great chef do in a kitchen? They make it look so easy. And the thing is, they only tend to use a certain number of utensils and things, which are tools. Whether they're knives or they're whisks or whatever it is they're using, they use them well and they know how to use those really, really well. Okay, so now some key points as far as capture. The first one is framing. Framing is your most basic thing. It's the first thing I learned as a photographer from my Uncle Sambo, who was a naval Top Gun pilot. Kind of cool. I mean, hey. And he was a photographer. So he taught me, he said, Mark, his name was Sambo, he used to call me Marco. So Marco, and I didn't know this word framing. I didn't know what it meant, never heard it before. He said, here's what you want to do. You want to put an edge around what you're photographing. And it just does, he didn't even tell me what it was going to do, but he said it just makes your photograph look better. Well, later on I kind of figured out why that actually works. So what it does, if you put a branch or an edge of a building or even a window frame, it does these things. It helps your viewer focus on what you want them to see. It adds depth, which is always good. So you don't want it to look flat. You want the viewer to get the idea that there's depth. Life has depth in it. It has layers. It adds interest and even contrast to your photograph. If I'm taking a picture of a person and there's an oak tree going like that, and the oak tree is just a silhouette, it kind of highlights their face. You know what I mean? It adds this contrast point. How about composition? You already talked about it a bit. Any other tips or advice in terms of getting great composition?
I'm looking for just things that kind of stack up and lead your eye away. Whether it's a straight line or whether it's the angle of the beach or something like that, framing is key. Whether it's a branch or you can take the most average mundane shot of just a beach with maybe a simple backdrop, and you kind of put a branch in there, you kind of peek through a tree or out a doorway or a window, and you just add an instant frame that kind of offsets your photo and makes it that much more unique.
How many of you are familiar with Chris Burkhardt? He's on Instagram. He has about close to 3 million followers now. He's phenomenal. His work is amazing. He was also young when I interviewed him. He had written a book when he was, I think, straight out of high school. It's called The California Surf Trip, where he and a buddy traveled from Northern California all through California taking pictures and writing, and all the way to Mexico, and they got it published. So it really launched his career. So remember, he said it can be something that leads your eye. It puts an edge around it, whether it's, like in this case, the branch. Just look for those things. And you probably are doing these things already. I'm just maybe telling you something you already know, but just keep that in mind, that that's how important it is, because it can totally make your photograph. Now, there's a second definition of framing. This is just an example of my own of framing. I mean, that was pretty, you can't get more framed than that. This is also in Big Sur, and there was a fence there, fence line, branches, which mimicked the coastline, which is kind of cool. But that puts a frame. It's as though we're looking through this window frame, right, to this beautiful coastline. Now, there's another example of framing. This is a photograph that I took in high school. I had a kind of an unusual high school experience where in the last semester of my senior year, I talked the principal into letting me go to Mexico and work in a really remote region, building a medical dispensary. And I took a Rolleiflex, which is a square negative. Who knows? You've seen them. It's just 2 1/4 square, big camera. But what was great about it is that you look down, and in many ways, much easier because you didn't have this camera in front of your face. A trick I learned was that I could usually count on the fact that the first frame or two, the person was going to be really stiff. I'm going to come up to you and take your picture, and you would be like this. Then I'd just keep talking to you, and I'd say, hey, how's it going? What's it like? And I'm just pushing the shutter. I'm continuing to push the shutter. You can do that with any camera. That's just a kind of a travel, spontaneous photography tip. Engage the person. Keep talking to them. You'll hear more about that from another photographer in a minute. But this was another frame. You can use door frames. You can use window frames. And what does it do to the subject? It draws your eye right to him. By the way, that is not a rule of thirds photograph, is it? I've tried it. I actually tried cropping it and moving it over. It just didn't look right because you need kind of this whole, notice how it's a square frame. Okay, so another definition of framing, and this is a shot, and you'll see the actual photograph in a minute. This is 35 millimeter. If you're using a modern digital camera, a full frame sensor is the same size as a 35 millimeter piece of film. Okay? And it's this shape right here. That's another definition of framing. It's what is it that's happening out there? How can I make it fit into this frame and be interesting? So there may not be any edge on it or that other definition that I showed you, but it's you moving around until you go, okay, this is going to be interesting right here. That's framing. And like in this case, I'm shooting a line of people here and I can see one face after another. That's kind of interesting. That wouldn't be bad, okay? And I'm eliminating like chairs back there and things that will distract people. So that's part of what I'm doing when I'm framing. Does that make sense? It's you using that frame and filling the frame, and remember, really being responsible for everything in the frame. Okay, this is an example that I'm going to talk about in a second here of using angles. This happened to be kind of a wild thing. A bunch of kids piled up some chairs. Now this is shot straight on, and this is shot with the camera at an angle, okay? You can't probably decide from these two which is most interesting, but this is just sort of the normal view that you would have standing here looking out like that. As soon as you tilt the camera, it gives you a completely different point of view. And the great thing about photography is you can shoot from any angle, and each angle is going to tell the viewer something a little different, which is what we're going to talk about now. So in studying filmmaking, I came across this book called How to Shoot a Movie Story, which as a still photographer you would probably never pick up because you think it's about making movies. But they go into this whole description in this book, and I haven't seen this in a still photography book, about the power of angles. A camera angle can control an audience's attention and reactions. They emphasize what you want your audience to see and how you want them to see it. How do you want them to feel about it? So there's that same shot. Would you agree that's more interesting than if I had just kept the camera straight? There's something about that kind of controlled chaos, right? Everything is at an angle. I love angles. I love geometry, which we're going to talk about, because that's a very powerful element that you can add to your photography. You're shooting in a place like Paris, and everybody's taken 1 million pictures of the Eiffel Tower. Do you want to come home with the same photograph that 200 million photographers have already taken, or that you might as well have just gotten off the postcard rack? Or do you want to try to find something that's a little different? Well, that's what I try to do. So that's the Eiffel Tower, angling up. Funny story about this. So I was doing a final run through my book, you know, and I wanted it to be perfect. By the way, I will tell you that my publisher did a really good job of design work. The book, I believe, is really visually interesting. So it's not just a lot of text. There's a lot of photographs in here. Everything is illustrated. So I was going through kind of a final run with the book, and I remembered I had a photograph of the Eiffel Tower at night. And I kind of remember coming across something. Has anybody ever heard that the French government can fine you for putting a nighttime photograph of the Eiffel Tower? Have you heard that? It's true. It's not a rumor. You know why? Okay, it's really simple. The Eiffel Tower was built in over 100 years ago. It's in the public domain. They added the lights to it in 1980-ish. These dates may be totally wrong, and you can criticize me later. They added the lights to it within the last 30 years, 25, 30 years. And they consider that a copyrighted work. If you take a picture of the Eiffel Tower and you display it or you sell it, they can slap a big fine on you and make you take that picture down. So I remember this, I Googled it, and it actually is true. So I went, well, wait a minute. I don't want to put that picture in my book and have the French government call me up and say, Monsieur, you owe us, and take that picture out of your book. So I went back to my library, and lo and behold, I had this daytime picture that I never even used. I never even paid attention to it. It wasn't black and white. I made it into a black and white because I thought it made it more interesting. There's a lot of texture here, and the clouds are interesting. It just goes to show what to watch out for, but also keep those photographs because you never know when you're going to use them. High angles do something really interesting. They reduce the height of the subject, and it creates a superior viewpoint for the viewer. Here's a good example. Florian Schultz, a phenomenal wildlife photographer. These are whales. To get a perspective, look at how big they are. This is a dolphin here. You know how big they are. Dolphin would be like from here to there with tip to tail. And that's how big these whales are. But look at how, from our vantage point in a helicopter looking down, we get the idea that we're kind of superior. We're in a bigger, higher position. That's what looking down will do. When you go to the movies, when they're trying to emphasize a small area or the smallness of the subject or whatever, they shoot it from above. And a lot of times they'll come down, so you get that overall vantage point, and then as you come down and you get closer and closer and closer, it's a great effect. Okay, low angles exaggerate height, it speeds up motion, and the subject commands attention. John Todd, phenomenal sports photographer, look at those things. So go back here for a second. Low angle. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'm below it where the subject is commanding attention. And don't you get the feeling of speed coming from that? So he's sitting down here. The subject is up higher than him. Keep that in mind for sports photography. Whenever you want to look like you're speeding up or the motion or getting the viewer to really see it as though it's happening, that's something really easy to do. The most important thing to do with your body is to make it move around wherever you need it to go. There's a story of Annie Leibovitz shooting Arnold Schwarzenegger on skis, and she wanted to get a low enough angle, but she couldn't get it, so they actually dug away the snow for her to get down into the snow, so she wasn't just like kneeling like this. The snow level was here, and there's Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he was like huge in the frame. But that's what you do. There's a joke that kind of goes along with this, and this is also about being responsible for everything in the frame. Irving Penn, great photographer, said, you know, photography is 90% moving furniture. And, you know, what he meant by that was that you have to be ready. You go into a scene, it doesn't look right, move stuff around. There's no rule against that. You know, if you have a rule, that's fine, but you don't have to have everything stay exactly where it is. If I'm going to take a picture of these books here, for sure I'm going to get rid of this. Why do I want this shiny object to distract your eye? All I want you to see is the books. So I'm going to for sure clean this thing up. I'm not going to shoot with that because that's where your eye is going to go. I'm going to change this all around. Okay. Side angles, they give depth and perspective to people and objects and also can add speed as well. This is another photograph from Florian Schultz. There's a, you know, you get the idea, there's a lot of space back here, don't you? We're shooting it from the side, gives a lot of motion again. Language of geometry. Joe McNally says, you gotta learn the language of light. Light is a language that you need to learn to speak. Geometry is another language. Geometry works in a photograph. Again, my friend here, Henry Cartier-Bresson, he says his greatest joy is geometry. He says it's a pleasure for him. It's an intellectual pleasure. It makes everything kind of fall into place. It's a recognition of order that's in front of you. Look for geometry because it's out there all over the place. And you'll find just by adding that element to your photographs, it's going to make for an interesting shot. And here's an example. It's right on the cover of my book. And the model happens to be right here. It's my wife, Jan. This is the d'Orsay Museum. Anybody been there? It's really cool. You look out into Paris here. I have another shot here where you can actually see Paris. But I wasn't trying to emphasize, you can just barely see some stuff. I didn't want to emphasize Paris. I wanted to capture the geometry. She actually art directed this shot. And she's standing off center, which adds some interest. I think if she was dead center, it would have changed the whole thing. But this shot is all about geometry. I mean, look at how many geometric figures are in there. You know, you've got circles, you've got lines, you've got squares, you've got pie-shaped, you know, pieces. It's geometry. If you learn nothing else from what I said today, leave here and remember, go out and capture a shot right away with geometry, okay? Before I forget, and this is for everybody watching too, if you hashtag, and I'll show you this later, hashtag on Instagram, AYP Club, Advancing Your Photography Club, hashtag it, we can critique you. Other people can add, and these are photographers, not just like giving you a, you know, a love thing, but let's get real critiquing going. And I'm also doing kind of a YouTube live periodically where I'll pick some of these and we'll talk about them. So just add to your hashtags, AYP Club. Okay. Bob Holmes, who I've already mentioned, said that, you know, diagonal lines and symmetry both add interest and vitality to your photograph. This is a photograph that he won a Photographer of the Year award, Travel Photographer of the Year award. He'd won 4 of them, or this was his 4th award. And he showed me, I have a YouTube video where he showed me the progression. First, this one woman walked by, then the second woman, then the third. And you know, the third one, it kind of looks interesting, but it wasn't until the 4th stepped into the frame it had just popped. But notice the diagonal lines. Isn't that cool how it just leads your eye? So you can see why he won that award, right? Diagonal lines add interest and vitality. Again, we're talking about geometry. Here's another example of his. Symmetry. Symmetry is very powerful. So what do we have? We have the symmetry of the stairs and the boys being asymmetrical. So there's that juxtaposition there. That's another thing that works in photography, is one thing versus another thing. And again, that's true in painting and all art. So you have this beautiful symmetrical view, but what if the boys weren't there? It would just be a picture of a set of stairs. It wouldn't be that interesting. Bob is a phenomenal photographer, and I mention him a lot in the book, and I've done a lot of videos with him. Converging lines. Remember, Chris Burkhardt mentioned that. He said you want to have a line that leads the viewer's attention. Do you remember that? And he was showing at that moment some logs kind of, your eyes just kind of went down the beach to where you wanted to go. It's called a leading line, or converging lines are where you have two lines. Well, here's an example. This is one of mine. This is a girl walking on a road in Vermont, and your eye just kind of naturally goes to her. Those lines bring you to the subject. And you notice there's not a lot going on else besides the road and her. You know, the trees just form another frame there. So that converging line is just another handy tool. You can do that, railroad lines, roads, many different kinds of lines can come together, you know, when you're looking at it from a distance. Okay, here's our friend Cartier-Bresson, capturing the moment. Now there's a thing that you might wonder about. You could say, hey, look, Mark, you told me I got to visualize everything. Doesn't that just slow you down? And what if something happens like that? Are you going to miss all those shots? No. Visualization still plays a part. Even if it was, I am going to go to this area because there's a lot of action going on and I want to capture the exact right action, that's a form of visualization. But going beyond that, you can actually get to the point where your visualization can happen so fast that you press the shutter at the exact right moment, which means you actually have to anticipate the shot. Because if you're shooting action, if I jump up in the air and you don't press the shutter at the right moment, I might have already landed. There's a lag there. So you have to anticipate it, and you have to say, okay, I'm going to press the shutter right here, and now I'm going to get at the top of that arc. Okay, so here's an example of capturing the moment. This is a photograph that I took in the 8th grade. These are my classmates jumping off a sand dune with the sun going down behind them. So it's a perfect silhouette. It was backlit. You couldn't ask for better conditions. So in the book, I show you the contact sheet. A contact sheet, for those who weren't around the film days, you took strips of negatives, 35 millimeter in this case. You laid them on a piece of printing paper, you exposed them, and it came out as a sheet. They're all little tiny, photographs. And from that sheet, you could choose which ones you wanted to enlarge, and that's what you did. So in this case, I pressed the shutter at the exact right moment because there's a perfect arc here. And I still don't know how I did that, but thankfully I did, because a millisecond later, this was all gone. This guy was jumping in the air. He would have been down. She would have been down. It all would have gone away, and it would have been a sort of a nothing photograph. So it's getting, and this goes back to getting so familiar with your equipment that you're not fumbling ever. You're not thinking, what f-stop, and, am I focused? You have to be fast and precise. And this is where just knowing your equipment inside and out really can pay off. Okay, making use of light. I had the wonderful job of interviewing, again, as I said, some of the world's best photographers. This was Matthew Jordan Smith, celebrity photographer, Oprah Winfrey's favorite photographer. He shot every big movie star you can imagine. And I asked him a couple of questions. I asked him a lot of questions, but I asked him about light. So how do you make use of the light? And here's what he said. What are some good tips for lighting?
If you're outside, be aware of the light. Be aware where the sun is. Is the sun very high? If the sun's very high, you have these shadows under your eyes, under your nose. It's not very flattering. But as that sun comes down, around like 5, 6, 7 o'clock, you get this beautiful light. The light's right in your face. And it takes out all the shadows, all the age out of your face. Make that light as even as possible on your face, on your subject's face as you're shooting. So that old rule of having the sun at your back really works. Same thing in the studio. Having that light imitate the sun, where it's down at this angle where it's coming right at you. I know a lot of people have the light off to the side a lot and casting, shadows, and that's not always flattering. Make that light look like the sun at the end of the day. Follow that law and you'll do well all the time.
Follow that law and you'll do well all the time. I love that. How simple is that? Okay, there's more to know than that in lighting, but that's a really good point. Why do we call it the golden hours? Because the light is warm, it's soft, and it's going to be more flattering. Do not take a portrait of a woman or a man in the middle of the day and expect them to be happy with it. They're not going to like seeing their face broken up with all these shadows. Wait till the golden hours. Now, I actually have an app on my phone that reminds me when the golden hours are coming. What are the golden hours? Basically, a half an hour before sunset and a half an hour after, and a half an hour before sunrise and a half an hour after. Those are the times when you as a photographer should really be busy. Okay? If you're traveling, do stuff in between. Go shopping, swimming, take a nap, but be ready for those golden hours. Now there's something that happens after the golden hours. You guys know what it is? It's the blue, it's not really an hour, but it's the blue hour. So the light goes from this yellow-orange spectrum during the golden hours, which is beautiful, to as the sun is going down after that, the sky turns blue. You look up at the sky after sunset, about a half hour, 45 minutes after sunset. Yeah, the blue hours can be very interesting as well. But let's just stick with the golden hours. So you can see what he did here. And he's talking about studio lighting doing the same thing. Don't have it like these, as far as shooting stills, we've got 3 soft boxes here. Actually, it's probably okay. It's balancing it out. I don't know if these look like they're pretty much daylight balance. We could make it a little warmer and it will help the person look better, which is, generally speaking, what you're trying to do as a photographer. I say generally speaking because, maybe you're trying to draw out the oddness of their face. If you're shooting a horror film or something, you might want to do that. Yeah. But that's a really, really, really simple tip. Take advantage of the golden hours. And it's not just, sometimes you can think about, well, that's a good time to capture sunsets or clouds in the sky. It's a great time to take portraits. It really is. And another tip, this book is packed with them, by the way. Usually, the sun is going down. Where are you facing? Into the sun, because that's the most dramatic thing around. You're going, wow, look at that. That's amazing. Wow, how cool is that? But where is your subject going to look most interesting? Where should you stand? If the sun is going down and it's hitting her face, I'm going to stand over here. I'm not going to be looking at the sun. I'm looking at her face. Or another object, for that matter. I don't think I have this queued up here, but you can't really see. It's very small here. But this is an example of shooting this bridge as the sun is going down over here. The bridge just was lit up. It was amazing. It was like, whew, like that. But I had to turn around to see it that way. So remember, your best friends are your feet. okay? Really important. That's true with angles, moving around. That's true with composing in the camera. That's true with taking candid pictures of people. You know, I've heard this piece of advice from many different photographers. Take a few more steps in. You know, sometimes we're a little timid and we want to sort of stand outside of the scene. Don't do that. Get in there. You're gonna get more interest that way. So be willing to move around, find the shot, make the shot happen. Now, I'm gonna really skim over this section here. This is the next area, which is processing. I'm not gonna try to teach you a whole Lightroom class in 10 minutes. It's pointless. But I'm gonna give you a few tips, okay? Just a few things here and there. I use Lightroom. How many of you guys use Lightroom? Okay, I'm talking to the converted. I still use Photoshop a lot too. The great thing about Lightroom is you can move easily. They're both Adobe. You just edit in, you know. I go to Photoshop, do what I need to do, come back to Lightroom usually. But the other cool thing is there's a mobile app for Lightroom. How many of you use it? A couple people. I really love it because it synchronizes between my desktop and my mobile app. What I like about it is I'd rather do my heavy editing not on an app. I want to do it on my desktop computer. So I can take a photograph with my iPhone. It will sync automatically to my desktop. I edit it, and it's already back into my phone. So there's no moving pictures around. You know, you ever have that problem? You email them to yourself or you Dropbox or whatever. You don't have to do any of that. It's already there. You've finished your editing. It's back on your phone. Pretty cool. So you can synchronize things. So I really recommend get to know Lightroom really well. I've got a 6-minute tutorial on YouTube that will actually get you up to speed in 6 minutes. You're not going to learn everything, but it'll take you through the basic panel. So if you go to my YouTube channel, Marc Silber, M-A-R-C-S-I-L-B-E-R, you can find that Lightroom tutorial. Here's just a couple of tips. So remember that your visualization carries through the entire process, including processing. So what does that mean? Maybe when you took the photograph, you were thinking, wow, I want this to be a black and white. See, in the old days, we didn't have that luxury. It was either black and white or it was color. And you couldn't mix them together. You could go, yeah, okay, you could go from color to black and white, but it was really uncommon to do that. Well, you certainly can't go the other way around. So today, digitally, we can decide how we want to present it. Sometimes when I'm taking a photograph, I go, look, there's hardly anything colorful in this picture. I'm going to make it a black and white. It's going to be more dramatic. And I know when I capture it, this is going to be a black and white. Usually I don't necessarily know that. So when I go back, and now I'm looking at it on the computer, I can decide there's no real point in leaving it as a color photograph because there's no color. It's going to look way better as a black and white. I revisualize it. Does that make sense? Get my new idea there. So you decide, don't go through an automatic process again of, okay, this is what I do every time. Take a minute, visualize it, see how you want it. Use your histogram. How many people use the histogram? Good, and your camera too, because that'll keep you from clipping, which means missing detail, which is really important. It's a really simple tool. I have a video that covers that, and I talk about it in the book. This is kind of a nice example of a well kind of formed histogram. But I'm going to tell you one other thing. Looking at your histogram all the time is kind of like going for a drive in a beautiful place and looking at your speedometer the whole time, making sure you're not going too fast. You're going to miss everything. You glance every now and then at your gas gauge, at your speed. You glance at those things, but really you're looking out the window, right? Same thing is true. I am not wedded to a perfect histogram. And sometimes I don't even care. I go, well, it just looks better this way. Even the histogram doesn't look great. It guides me, but ultimately it's about the photograph. It's not about how your histogram looks. But it is a tool. It is a guideline. It shows you your ranges of light. It's a really fairly simple. Darks and shadows are over here. Your mid-tones are here, and your highlights. And you just want to see that we're not clipping anything at either end. Okay. It's in the book. When I'm in Lightroom, I work from the top down, generally speaking. Basically just come down the panel, setting my white balance. I use the eyedropper tool whenever I can. It doesn't mean that you can't also tweak that. You want it to have a little more blue or a little more magenta, go ahead. It's your photograph. Okay, do it. And then I'm basically setting each one of these. There's a cool tip here on whites and blacks. If you hold down in a Mac, the Option key, as you slide that, you'll see where it's clipping or not. You'll also see it up here in the histogram, but that's kind of a handy thing. I tend to add black as much as I can. Being a black and white photographer, fundamentally, we always wanted a pure black. And I want to get as much of a pure black as I can get and a pure white. So I like to control those two to the extreme that I can without it, clipping out the picture. Clarity is a cool thing. Clarity will add texture. So if you're out taking a landscape and you slide your clarity over to the right, you're going to get more and more texture. It's the mid-tone contrast. But the other thing about it, if you're taking a portrait of somebody, do you necessarily want those lines in their face to be accentuated? Probably not. It's your mom, Mother's Day, right? You can slide this clarity over this direction. It will soften up those lines. Don't do it too much because it's going to look really phony. But it's just a nice little control point. And by the way, in photography, just like cooking, sometimes a little tiny bit is all you need. When they say a dash of salt, they don't mean take the salt shaker and pour it into the... You're going to ruin it. You're going to ruin that beautiful stew. A little dash, right? A little tiny bit of one of these things can make all the difference. Just moving that clarity a little bit can actually change it. Okay. There's your 3-minute class in Lightroom. Okay, we are now at the final stage of the cycle of photography, which is sharing your work. Okay? What happens when you start sharing it is you bring others into it, which is really what it's all about. They're talking, they're interacting, they're having their own experience, which is what photography is at the end of the day. It's like, look, I was in Paris and I shot this photograph. I was in Mexico and I got this experience. Now I'm letting you see what I saw. And your interaction is what we live for. I mean, there's nothing greater than hearing that kind of feedback, would you agree, from people? Because you get to hear from them what they're experiencing. So the final stage is you basically, first of all, there's a visualization of you as a photographer. What type of photographer do you want to be known as? In other words, you can be in a whole bunch of different genres of photography, but what do you want to be known for? It's your vision of yourself as an artist, and you want to clearly establish that for yourself. And the sooner you do that, the better. It doesn't mean you have to be locked in there forever, but you'll find that great photographers are known, or great artists, are generally known for one genre. Cartier-Bresson, street photography. Annie Leibovitz, celebrity photography. Even though she's taken a lot of landscape photographs, who thinks of Annie Leibovitz in landscape? You don't, okay? Bob Holmes, travel photographer of the year. Vermeer, the painter, he was known for natural everyday life. So pick your genre and get really, 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 really expert at it. That's an important piece of advice. Get it down. But only you can decide what your genre is. It could be it could be sports. It could be children. It could be weddings. It's up to you to decide. And we're going to touch upon some of these. Ways to get your work out, obviously social media. I like SmugMug. You can create a gallery there, online gallery. Get your prints made, frame them, put them on the wall, show your work. I already mentioned this. Go to #AYPclub.com or just AYP Club to get critiques. Okay, now quickly, we're going to hit some tips from some of the genres of photography. I cover 9 of them in the book. First one, portrait tips. Bambi Cantrell, phenomenal portrait photographer and wedding photographer. Here's what she said about putting your subject at ease and expression beating out perfection. So Bambi, what are sort of the 1, 2, 3 steps that you follow when you approach any kind of photograph?
The first thing that I do, if I'm not shooting in my studio, obviously in my studio I'm very familiar with where the light's coming from, is I want to find where the light source, where the prettiest light source is. Because that's my foundation. I must lay that first. The second thing that I'm going to look for is the location itself. Is it a distraction? I like clean, simple lines. When you look through any of my photography, very seldom do you see a lot of background. It's not about the location to me. It's about the face and about the subject. Once I have identified the location where I want my subject to appear, where I want them to be, the most important element that has to go into it is having my subject forget the camera's there. So I really want to take a personal interest in my subject at that point, look into their eyes and talk with them and get them to forget about that monster, the camera that's there, and then really be able to pull from them great expression, because at the end of the day, expression beats perfection any day of the week. And if you have the most perfect photograph in the universe, it's a 0 if you have no expression from your subjects. And if you have fabulous expression, all bets are off. There's no bad photograph. If you have a great expression if you're photographing your child at home, you're a mom and you have the most fabulous expression off your little child, and there's a light socket on the floor, who cares? Nobody will ever see it because the expression on your child's face is so phenomenal.
Okay, remember that. Expression beats perfection. By the way, she's a real kick. She was doing my photographs, and she does everything you can imagine to draw out communication from you, including off-color jokes, asking you what your favorite color is, what do you like to do. She's engaging. You could probably see she's talking through the whole thing, and she's watching your face and expression, and that's in my book. So if you want to get expression out of people, be willing to engage them. Don't just sit there and press the shutter. Photography is about people. If you're taking photographs of people, if you're just taking photographs of rocks and mountains, maybe not. But when we're photographing people, engage them. Okay, Chris Burkhardt again gave me some great tips on environmental portraiture. What's the difference between a portrait and an environmental portrait? A portrait could be taken anywhere. Environmental portrait means you go to that person's environment and take a picture of them, and the environment usually helps you tell the story about that person. If they're a pianist, they're sitting at their piano. If they're a chef, they're in their kitchen, etc. And in Chris's case, he does a lot of surf photography, outdoor photography. So he was taking pictures of these guys in their natural environment. This is a great example of an environmental portrait. This is Chris Burkhardt, taken by Eric Johnson. And what we're seeing here, and you'll hear Chris mention this, we're seeing Chris looking at something. Like, what's he looking at? That's kind of the interesting thing about this photograph. All right, let's hear what he has to say.
I've always been about like kind of moody, black and white, the moments in between. Like, I mean, I've shot in the rain, I've shot in the snow. I don't even care, because sometimes that's all part of the trip. You know, you're going to get your A+, great sunny photos, but it's kind of like about building the story. And so I always look for those moments in between, where it's someone maybe just getting ready, or they don't know you're shooting, or you stop and you see something that's just like absolutely beautiful, and maybe it's more than just capturing like that moment, but you want to kind of pull back and see like, okay, this is all beautiful, but what's going to be more interesting? Is it going to be me taking in this moment, or is it going to be the people I'm with? What is their reaction, and kind of pull back and see like, what are they thinking? What are they experiencing? Maybe they're like jumping up and down, looking at the surf or something like that, or waxing up their boards, or frantically doing this or that. And I think that when you stop and think about what's going to be the most significant thing, a lot of times it's not necessarily what you're seeing, but it's what someone else might be seeing. And so if you kind of take a step behind them, that's a good way to try and survey things too.
Pretty amazing. So it's what is the person looking at? What are they interested in? And then he talked about the moments in between. What does that mean? It's like action is going on. There can be like the moments in between each photograph. Those can be the most interesting. So don't stop taking pictures. Even if they're feeling posed, I mentioned that earlier, just keep pressing the shutter. You want to get those moments when they're really being themselves. And he does a great job at that. That's what environmental portraiture is. I happen to love that genre myself. Okay, children. Lena Hyde, phenomenal photographer. Come on. Doesn't that just melt your heart? Come on. Okay, so what is here's her tips for getting photographs with children. Make it fun for them. Find out when they're happiest. Don't shoot them at the end of the day when they're all tired and cranky. When are they happiest? Okay, ask mom or dad. Like if you're shooting somebody else's kids, 10 o'clock in the morning, good, that's when you should do your shoot. Keep your equipment simple. Don't get distracted. Don't distract them or yourself with a lot of equipment. She says she keeps it really simple. Make a simple background, a non-cluttered background, which is always a good piece of advice no matter whether you're shooting children or not. With babies and newborns, have the parents involved. So they're holding the child usually. She uses finger puppets and other props. Keep the children interested. Those are things you can get, and just bring with you. Keep them in your camera bag. And you want to help them forget the camera, just like Bambi Cantrell mentioned. She said one thing she does is she shoots on the floor a lot. She'll have the kids on the floor, she'll be on the floor, and she leaves the camera equipment on the floor for them to play with before she starts shooting. So they're already kind of accustomed to, this is kind of cool, this camera here. So when she picks it up, it's kind of desensitized, They're already feeling comfortable. And she's sitting or kneeling right there with them. So it's a comfortable place for the child, which is the most important thing. And then again, remember to get down low, shoot from different angles, but get down there with them. Sports, this is one of my sports photographs. Again, perfect arc, capturing the moment. A second later, it was all gone. That was pre-visualized. I had a magazine shoot. I wanted to get all the polo players together, and I took it with a fairly long lens, a telephoto lens, down the field. You have to, because otherwise you get run over. I almost got run over. There's the ball. But I pre-visualized that. Keeping it simple and clean, make the subject pop out of the frame. These are from John Todd, who I introduced you to before with the swimmers. Work out the story that you're going for. Like in that case, I came back with exactly what I had visualized. What do you want in this sports photograph? Do you want the same kind of like everyday pictures that every other mom and dad is taking? Or do you want to have something cool with your kid or your grandson or whatever? What are you going for? Come back with that. Shoot high, shoot low. Get up, high in the stands and look down. That'll give it perspective. Get down low, as we already covered. That'll give it action. Train yourself to focus rapidly, because these shots are moving fast. He actually says he goes out in the backyard and just practices focusing. Here's a guy who's already an experienced pro. Just practice quickly focusing, quick focus, quickly capturing that, because it'll be gone in a second if you don't. So you don't miss those decisive moments. Weddings. Okay, we're going to be going to some weddings. You know, it's wedding season. So maybe you're not going to be the wedding photographer, but these are important tips anyway. Create a shot list beforehand. By the way, that's just a good tip. Like if you're traveling and you want to, just before you even go on the trip, write down the shots that you want to come back with. Eiffel Tower, definitely. I'm going to nail that. You know, a Paris cafe, I'm going to get that. In this case, if you're shooting an entire wedding, you cannot miss anybody in it. You can't miss the great aunt or the brother, or, you know, it's not going to look good if you don't have photographs of them. So you actually make a detailed shot list. But then you also get the ones, like Chris said, the moments in between that you weren't expecting. Those are called candids. So you want your detail list of people, then you want all those candid shots. You want to see how the subjects really interact with each other. In that previous photograph, you know, there's an interaction here. Okay, so that's not necessarily your typical wedding photograph, and it may not even be the wedding, or it might be an engagement photograph, but there's an interaction going on there. And then you go for it. You make sure you don't miss any important shots because you have created your shot list. And that's just type it out before, put it in your camera bag, check them off as you get them. Okay? Keep it low tech. Don't put it on your phone, put it on a piece of paper. Okay, how to continue to advance, and we're almost to the Q&A part here. Read and apply this book. Okay? If you don't have a copy, get one. As soon as we're done, I'll sign it for you. Follow me at these places. Marc Silber on YouTube. You'll see, as I said, over 300 videos. A lot of the information I told you today is in one of those videos. Follow me on Instagram. Hashtag AYP Club. That's my website. You can start a club with a group of photographers who get together and they watch the videos, they use the book, and then give each other assignments. Okay, so let's say we're going to meet once a week. We watch a video on sports photography. We talk about it. What do we learn from this thing? And then the assignment is go shoot some sports photography and bring it back with you next week, and you'll get critiqued. And you really can keep yourself advancing and going forward continuously. Okay, thanks again, you guys. I really enjoyed talking with you.